The sun hovered over Dust Hollow like a branding iron, scorching everything it touched. Heat shimmered off the warped planks of the auction platform, distorting the view like a fever dream. Flies buzzed lazily in the dry air, and a hush fell over the crowd as a thin girl limped into view, guided by a man who held her arm too tightly. Her name was Sarah Louise, though no one had asked it. Her dress was threadbare, hanging from her shoulders like a forgotten curtain, and her left leg dragged with every step, a limp that had branded her worthless in the eyes of men who measured value by strength and obedience. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She kept her eyes down and bit her lip, steadying herself. "Damaged, but still useful," the seller called out, his voice oily. "Strong arms." Young, could manned cook carry a fair price for a girl like this? No hands rose. The silence stung sharper than whips. $3, someone finally called from the edge of the crowd. Murmurs broke out. Laughter. $3. The cost of a pair of boots or a bottle of decent bourbon. The auctioneer shrugged. Sold. Sarah didn't look up as she was led away, not even when the man who had bought her approached the platform. He was tall, dressed in black wool, despite the heat, and carried a hat in his hand, rather than on his head. His hair was silver, his face lined. He said nothing. She glanced at him just once, and though he didn't speak, something in his eyes made her stop trembling. Before we continue this gripping tale of dignity and silent redemption, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories from the forgotten corners of history. You won't want to miss what comes next. They walked in silence. No wagon, no reins. He simply nodded toward the horizon and she followed, limping behind him. Children watched from shaded porches. Women turned away. One man spat. The judge, for that's who he was, Judge Emery Whitlock, didn't flinch. He didn't look at anyone but the road. Sarah's mouth was dry, her limbs aching. The dust stuck to her skin like guilt. She had been sold before, twice, but never this cheaply, never this quietly. The others had shouted, argued, drank while bargaining. This time the quiet was worse. They passed the edge of town, where the land turned brittle and the wind picked up dust like secrets. The judge walked steadily, never offering a word. She didn't dare ask where they were going. After an hour, a house came into view. Far off, wooden, alone, no smoke, no sound. Sarah Louise felt the fear return. She had no idea what this man wanted with her. But for $3, it couldn't be anything good. The sun had dipped low by the time they reached the house. It stood like a forgotten sentinel against the vast desert, worn but solid. The wooden boards creaked under Sarah's limp as she stepped onto the porch. The judge pushed open the door without a word and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the air was still. No warmth, no smell of food, just dust and quiet. The furniture was plain, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, a shelf of books untouched by time. He pointed to a narrow cot against the wall and then to a basin. No locks, no chains, just space and silence. Sarah sat, her legs trembling. She watched him move through the room with the same quiet resolve he'd walked with, placing his hat on a hook, lighting a single lantern. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask if she was hungry. He poured water into a tin cup and left it beside her. She didn't drink, not yet. That night she lay on the cot with eyes wide open, the silence pressed on her chest like a weight. In every other house she'd been kept in, there were always noises, shouting, footsteps, curses. Here there was only the creak of wind against the walls and once the quiet rustle of a page turning. In the morning she expected commands, orders. Instead, the judge left a slice of bread on the table and walked outside. Through the window she watched him feed the chickens, water the small patch of wilting vegetables, and mend a fence post without hurry. He worked alone, always alone. When he returned, he sat across from her. Not close, not far, just enough to see her eyes. He watched her limp when she fetched the cup, not with pity, with recognition. She waited for him to speak. He never did. On the third day she asked, barely above a whisper, "Why'd you buy me?" He looked up. Something shifted in his expression, but he didn't answer. He simply reached for his hat, placed it on his head, and walked outside. That silence cut deeper than a slap. She began to study him, the way he walked with purpose, never rushing. The way he paused at sundown, always at the same spot by the porch, eyes on the hills. She saw how he avoided the leftmost door in the hallway, the only one that stayed closed. Sarah didn't dare ask again, but she began to understand something. This man wasn't cruel. But he was carrying something heavy, and whatever it was, it kept him from speaking. Still, she couldn't trust the quiet. She knew too well that kindness often had a price, and no one paid $3 without expecting something in return. Days stretched into weeks beneath the endless sky. Sarah learned the rhythms of the ranch, morning chores in silence, meager meals at noon, dusk arriving like a curtain over the plains. The judge never raised his voice, never touched her, never asked anything of her she couldn't do. But he never smiled either. At night the wind rattled the windows and the floorboards creaked under the weight of memory. Sarah began to hear him speak after sundown, soft murmurs drifting from the front porch or his room, as if he were having conversations with someone who wasn't there. She pressed her ear to the door once. He spoke gently with pauses, as though listening for answers. "Forgive me," he whispered one night. "I didn't make it in time." Sarah didn't move. The way his voice cracked, it didn't belong to a judge or a man feared in town. It belonged to someone broken. One afternoon, while sweeping the hallway, Sarah paused before the closed door. It was the only one he never opened. The wood was worn and the brass knob dulled by time. Beneath it, dust had gathered like a warning. On the mantel above the cold fireplace, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A tiny bonnet, once white, now yellowed with age. Lace around the edges, stitched flowers faded. Beside it, a wooden figurine of a girl with a crooked leg carved into its stance. Sarah's chest tightened. She hadn't noticed the detail before. Now she couldn't unsee it. That night the judge sat on the porch longer than usual. She watched him from inside, the hat in his lap, his eyes on nothing. When he rose to go inside, he paused and looked at her through the glass. Not startled, not angry, just tired. He said nothing, as always. But she began to wonder if his silence was hiding something deeper than mere habit. A name lingered in her thoughts, unspoken but present. The kind of name a man like him would carry with him in silence, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Lillian. She didn't know where it came from or if it was right, but it felt like it belonged to the bonnet, to the closed door, to the man who whispered into the night and never answered her questions. She stopped fearing him, but trust didn't come easily. She'd been fooled before by quiet hands and soft words. Yet there was something in this house, a grief that had sunk into the wood. She felt it when she touched the walls, when she walked past that locked room. Sarah was no longer afraid of what might happen. She was afraid of what already had. Sarah hadn't cried in months, not when they took her from her last home, not when the man in the saloon sold her like scraps, not even when she stumbled trying to keep up with the judge across the dry plains. But now, in the quiet of this strange, haunted house, the tears came without sound, like rain falling through a roof already broken. She thought of her mother's hands, always rough from washing clothes, always warm despite the cold. She thought of the last time she saw her, coughing into a cloth spotted with red. After the sickness took her, no one came for Sarah. No relatives, no neighbors, just men with hard voices and dirt under their nails. She'd been passed around like a worn coin. One house made her scrub until her fingers bled. Another forced her to sleep in the barn with the goats. No one cared about the limp unless it slowed her down. Then there was punishment. That morning, she woke with a decision burning in her chest. She was going to run. She waited until the judge left for the well, then grabbed the crust of bread he'd left and stuffed it in her pocket. Her heart pounded as she slipped out the back, her steps uneven but determined. She didn't know where the road went, only that it led away. The desert was cruel, the sun unforgiving. Her leg throbbed by midday, and the water she'd stolen was gone by sunset. She collapsed near a rock formation shaped like broken teeth, her breath shallow, her limbs shaking. The silence, once heavy with grief, now roared with fear. She thought she saw her mother's face in the clouds, thought she heard her voice in the wind. But it was the judge who found her, hours later, as darkness crept across the sand. He didn't yell. He didn't demand to know why. He simply lifted her gently and carried her back to the house. Her body was too weak to resist. But her mind braced for what must come, except it didn't. He laid her on the cot, covered her with a blanket, and left a cool rag for her forehead. No threats, no locks. He stayed nearby that night, seated by the cold stove, the lantern casting his shadow, long and still across the wall. She opened her eyes once and saw him watching the flame. Not her. The flame. The next morning she waited for him to speak. He didn't, but when she sat up there was a cup of tea and a slice of apple waiting. For the first time, Sarah looked at him not with fear, but with confusion. Because in his silence, there was something she'd never felt before, not safety, but maybe mercy. It was the wind that opened the door. A storm rolled in from the west, sudden and wild, throwing dust against the windows like fists. Sarah rushed to close the shutters, her heart racing at the sound of thunder cracking over the hills. The judge had gone to the barn to secure the animals, leaving her alone in the house. That's when she saw it. That's when. The door at the end of the hall, the one always closed, always untouched, now hung slightly ajar. At first she thought it was her mind playing tricks, but as the lantern flickered in her hand, she stepped closer, breath caught in her chest. She pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The room inside was small but warm, a child's room. Dust covered everything, but the care once given to the space clung to every corner. A tiny bed with a hand-stitched quilt, shelves lined with faded books, and a worn doll missing one button eye. On the wall, drawings made in childish hands, stick figures and suns and crooked houses. But it was the crutches that made her stop. Two small wooden crutches leaned against the wall, polished from use. Next to them, a name carved into the bed frame, Lillian. Sarah stepped inside, barely breathing. The air felt heavy with memory. On the desk, a notebook lay open, its last page stained with ink, and the faint imprint of letters never finished. She traced the name with her finger. The limp, the bonnet, the silence. She understood now. The judge had once had a daughter. And she too had walked with a limp. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt like a wound left open for years, untouched but never forgotten. She sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger in the house. She felt like someone who had walked into a story already written in sorrow. She didn't hear him at first. But when she turned, he was standing in the doorway. His hat was in his hands, his face pale in the lantern light. "I didn't mean for you to see," he said softly. His voice was hoarse, rarely used. Sarah stood slowly. "She had a limp," she whispered. He nodded once painfully. "She died." He looked away. They mocked her, left her behind when the barn caught fire. "I wasn't home." A silence stretched between them, raw and human. "I couldn't save her," he said, "but when I saw you—" His voice broke. Sarah didn't move toward him. She didn't speak, but she didn't run. And for Judge Emery Whitlock, that was more grace than he'd known in a long, long time. In the days that followed, something subtle began to shift. The judge spoke a little more. Not often, and never about things that carried weight, but enough to show he was trying. He told her how to grind corn, how to heat the stove without cracking the iron, how to tie a proper knot in the fence wire. His voice remained quiet, but it no longer trembled with avoidance. Sarah listened. She learned. Each morning, he left a book by her plate. At first, she only stared at the pages, the letters blurring together like a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. But he sat across from her patiently, tracing the words with a steady finger. "Sound it out," he'd say just once, and she did. By the end of the week, she could read 3 pages without help. He built her a stool for the kitchen so she wouldn't have to strain her leg. Repaired her shoes with strips of leather, carved a handle for her walking stick, smooth and strong. There were no grand gestures, Just quiet ones, day after day, like someone patching a roof too long left leaking. One evening, they sat by the porch while the sun melted over the hills. The sky was gold, the land wrapped in silence. Sarah finally asked, "Did you buy me because I looked like her?" He didn't look at her. "No. Then why?" He turned the question in his mind before answering, "Because no one else would." She waited, unsure what to say. "And because I couldn't bear," he added after a moment, "to let another child be forgotten in plain sight." A promise, hidden in those words. By then word had started to spread through town. The judge who'd gone half mad was raising a girl with a crooked leg. Some scoffed, others whispered. A few, the crueler ones, hinted that maybe the silence of the house was hiding something unclean. Sarah overheard two men in the supply store laughing about it, calling her the ghost's replacement. She told the judge that night. He didn't shout. He didn't confront them. He simply said, "Let them talk." But she saw his hands tremble as he held his cup. He wasn't afraid of the town. He was afraid of what they might take from him again. Sarah understood then that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was being given space to become someone who could speak, learn, choose. That night, as she sat by the fireplace with her book, she looked over at the judge. "Will you teach me how to write?" she asked. He looked up, eyes steady. "Yes," he said. "You'll write your own name, your own story." And for the first time in her life, Sarah believed him. The wind changed before the trouble came. A storm rolled over the plains, not of weather but of voices, cruel, familiar voices. Sarah heard them before she saw the riders, 3 men on horseback, their shadows long against the dust, moving straight toward the judge's ranch. At the gate, the lead man dismounted with practiced arrogance. His boots hit the ground like hammers. Sarah's heart stopped. It was Graham Tolliver. She remembered the smell of his breath, the way he yanked her by the arm in saloons, made her scrub floors until her limp grew worse. He had sold her like livestock, and now he'd come to collect. "She's mine," he said, spitting tobacco near the porch. "Bought her fair before that judge stole her out from under me." The judge stepped forward, tall and still. "You sold her," he said evenly. "At auction, $3, witnessed by the town?" Graham sneered. "That wasn't real. I was drunk, didn't know what I was doing. I want her back." Sarah stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides. "She's not a sack of grain," the judge replied. "You lost that right the moment you treated her like one." Graham's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll take this to the circuit court." "You do that," Whitlock said. "And until then you leave my land." Graham laughed. "You really think a crooked leg and a faded name will stand up in court? That girl can't even speak right. Who's going to listen to her?" Sarah stepped forward. The judge tried to hold her back, but she shook her head. "I'll speak," she said. "I will." Her voice cracked, but it didn't break. "I remember every time he hit me, every meal he took for himself, every night he left me out in the cold barn. I remember all of it." The riders exchanged glances. This wasn't the trembling child they'd known. Graham's smile faded. "You think a judge's pet is enough to stop the law?" The judge looked at him, his eyes like stone. "No. But the law still has a voice, and this time it'll listen." They left, but not with surrender and with threat in their silence. That night, the ranch felt colder. The judge stood at the porch long after dark, rifle leaning against the rail. "They'll come back," Sarah whispered. "Yes," he said, "but so will the law." She touched the wooden handle of the walking stick he'd made her. Her hands no longer shook. "I want to tell them everything," she said. He nodded. "We'll go to town tomorrow," he said. Sarah looked out at the night, at the stars that blinked above like watchers. She wasn't just someone's burden anymore. She was a witness, and for the first time she had a voice no one would silence. The courthouse in Dust Hollow was little more than a wooden hall with worn benches and a judge's desk at the far end. But on that morning, it held the weight of something far greater than law. It held the weight of reckoning. People gathered early. Word had spread fast. Judge Whitlock was stepping down from the bench, not to preside, but to defend. And the girl no one had wanted, the one bought for $3, was going to speak. Sarah sat near the front, her shoulders straight despite the ache in her leg. The judge stood beside her, silent as ever, his presence steady. When the bailiff called order, a visiting magistrate from the next county took the bench. Whitlock stepped forward and placed his hat on the table before sitting beside Sarah. No robe, no gavel, just a man stripped of title, bearing truth. Graham Tolliver swaggered in, flanked by his two riders. He smirked as he took his seat, arms folded, like this was already over. "Miss Sarah Louise," the magistrate said, "you may speak." She stood. Her palms trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. "My name is Sarah Louise Turner. I was taken from my mother's body by sickness and handed to men who traded me like cattle. Graham Tolliver worked me like an animal. He hit me, starved me, made fun of how I walked." Graham rolled his eyes, but the room remained silent. "I was sold for $3. I thought it meant I was worth nothing. But Judge Whitlock never hurt me. He gave me food, a place to sleep. He taught me to read, to write. He didn't buy me to own me. He gave me back to myself." The magistrate leaned forward. "And do you wish to remain in his care?" Sarah's voice didn't waver. "I want to stay, and I want to be free." A murmur swept the room. Outside, the wind knocked dust against the windows like fists. Graham stood abruptly. "She's lying. This is all staged. The judge coached her." Whitlock rose slowly. He said nothing, only placed his hands on the bench, and then, in front of everyone, removed his hat and bowed his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He just stood in silence, letting Sarah's words be louder than any defense he could offer. The magistrate looked over the courtroom, saw the eyes of the town, once indifferent, now changed. He saw the girl who had found her voice and the man who had given her space to use it. "The court recognizes Sarah Louise Turner as a free individual, not subject to claim or ownership by any man. She shall remain in the care of Judge Emery Whitlock by her own choosing." A gavel struck. The sound was final, sharp, freeing, and Sarah exhaled not from relief, but from something she hadn't dared hope for, belonging. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if the townsfolk couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed. Some offered brief nods to the judge. Others looked at Sarah as though seeing her for the first time, not as a burden or a purchase, but as someone who stood taller than the shame placed on her. Outside, the air smelled of rain not yet fallen. Sarah felt it in her lungs, a coolness, sharp and clean. She turned to the judge, who had remained silent since the verdict. He picked up his hat from the table, but before placing it on his head, he looked at her, not with pride, with reverence. "You did that," he said quietly. "Not me." Back at the ranch, the sun was setting, the sky painted in soft fire. Sarah stepped into the house not as a shadow, but as someone who belonged. On the table rested something she hadn't noticed before, a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of being opened and closed. The judge motioned toward it. She lifted the lid. Inside was the faded bonnet, Lillian's, folded with care. And beneath it, a polished wooden plaque with one word burned into it by hand. Turner. Her fingers brushed over the letters. "It's yours if you want it," he said. The name, not a replacement, not to erase her, but to give you a place. She swallowed hard. Her voice was soft. Sarah Louise Turner. It felt whole. He placed the bonnet in her hands. "She would have liked you," he said, almost a whisper. Sarah hugged the bonnet close. She didn't cry, not this time. But her chest ached with something fuller than sadness, something almost like peace. That evening the house no longer felt quiet. It felt filled, not with noise but with purpose. A week later, the townsfolk gathered again, this time not for a trial, but for something else entirely. A child from another ranch had been found abandoned by a drunk uncle, barely fed, barely clothed. The town expected the child to be taken to the orphanage in Carson, but Sarah stepped forward. "There's room on the ranch," she said. "We have food, we can teach." The judge nodded behind her. No one questioned them. By spring, the house held 3 more children, each carrying the kind of silence Sarah once knew. And slowly, day by day, she helped them break it, with books, with laughter, with space to be. She hung the plaque on the front porch herself, Turner Ranch. Not a symbol of ownership, a symbol of belonging. And in the far back of the main room, beside a window that caught the best light, she kept the old bonnet in a glass case, beside a single silver coin, $3, the cost of a past that nearly swallowed her, and the proof of the future she built from it. Years passed, but Dust Hollow remained small, a dot on the map, forgotten by most. Yet for those who lived there, one place stood as a quiet miracle, the Turner Ranch. No longer a silent house tucked at the edge of the desert, it had become something else entirely, a refuge. At dawn, the sound of roosters broke the stillness, followed by children's voices, laughter tangled with the rustling of wind through cottonwood trees. In the kitchen, Sarah Louise, now taller, stronger, moved with practiced grace, her limp still there but no longer a burden, just a part of her stride. She taught reading on the front porch, writing at the dining table, patience in the garden, and courage wherever it was needed. Children came broken, frightened, scarred, but they stayed because they were heard, seen, named. One morning, she stood outside with a girl no older than she had once been. The child clutched a worn toy and stared at the sky. "Will I ever stop being afraid?" the girl asked. Sarah knelt beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Fear doesn't leave all at once," she said. "But one day you'll stop letting it tell your story." Inside, the judge sat by the window, his hair gone white, his hands slower. He no longer worked the fields, but still carved wooden handles for walking sticks, just in case someone else arrived in need of one. He rarely spoke in public, but when he did, people listened, because in a world of noise, his silence had always carried weight. As the sun rose over the plains, Sarah stood at the edge of the porch and looked out across the land. Crops were beginning to sprout. The barn had been rebuilt. The classroom held 5 desks now. Beside the door, the silver coin remained framed above the plaque, a reminder of how low her price had once been set. Now her value was something no one could measure. If you followed Sarah's journey this far, from dust to dignity, from silence to voice, take a moment to subscribe. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered, and many more still wait to be told. And if her strength moved you, click the next video on your screen to meet another soul shaped by the Wild West, an outlaw who ran from the gallows but found redemption where no one dared look. Because sometimes the strongest stories don't come from those who shout, but from those who rise in silence and choose to stay.